All right, seventh grade. Well, these directions are going to sound familiar. This idea of simplify the expression. We're just taking it to a different level today. Now, remember what we've talked about. Anytime we have a number outside of parentheses, it's going to mean multiplication. And pretty much up until now, we haven't had a number outside the parentheses, but that's going to change today. So here, outside the parentheses, I have a negative 1. So essentially, I'm taking negative 1 times all of the numbers that are in there. Well, a negative 1 times x is going to be a negative x. Remember, there's a 1 there in front of that, x. I don't put it there, it's just understood. Negative 1 times 1 equals negative 1. Not going to put the 1 there, so it's just negative x. Negative 1 times a positive 9 is a negative 9. There's no like terms to combine there, so my final answer is negative x minus 9. Well, when I come over here, 2/3 being multiplied by, in parentheses, a negative 3z minus 6. So it's 2/3 times a negative 3, or 2/3 times 3. I can do a little scratch work. 2/3 times 3 over 1. Both of these are divisible by 3 in my cross-checking, so they would both just become a 1. 2 times 1 is 2. 1 times 1 is 1. I end up with 2 over 1, which is just 2. But this is a positive and this is a negative, so it's a negative 2z. And I do the same thing, 2/3 times a negative 6, so I can just come down here. 2/3 times 6 over 1. Once again, I can't cross-check a 1 and a 2. Nothing goes into both 1 and 2 except 1. But I can cross-check a 3 and a 6 by dividing by 3. 6 divided by 3 is 2. 3 divided by 3 is 1. That leaves me with 2 times 2, which is 4. 1 times 1, which is 1. 4 over 1, which I know is 4. But it's a positive times a negative 6. So it has to be a negative 4. And I end up with negative 2z minus 4. All right, moving right along. Negative 1.5 being multiplied by 8m minus n. Well, negative times a positive, I know it's going to end up being negative, but it's going to involve a little scratch work to do 1 and 5/10 times 8. I would just do this like I would do 15 times 8. 8 times 5 is 40. Put the 0 down, carry the 4. 8 times 1 is 8, plus the 4 is 12. I get 120. I have one digit that comes after the decimal in the problem. So I have one digit that needs to come after the decimal in the answer. So I get 12.0, or just 12. But it's a negative 1.5 and a positive 8, so it has to be a negative 12. Well, here now it's a negative 1.5 times a negative n. There's no number in front of the n, so we understand that that is a 1. Negative 1.5 times a negative 1. Well, a negative times a negative has to be a positive, and anything times 1 has to be the other number. So a negative 1.5 times a negative 1 has to be a positive 1 and 5/10, or 1.5 n. And of course, this is 12m. And if I wanted to switch that up, 1.5 n plus a negative 12m, that would be okay. And of course, adding a negative 1.5 n, adding a negative is just subtracting. And that gives me 12m. Any one of those three answers would be considered acceptable. All right, moving right along. 2 times negative 3s plus 1 minus 5. Well, first of all, it's going to be all of these multiplied by 2. 2 times a negative 3s, well, positive 2, negative 3 is going to be negative 6, but it has to be a negative 6s. 2 times a positive 1 is a positive 2, and 2 times a negative 5. A positive and a negative has to be a negative. That's going to be negative 10. Well, I'm looking for like terms that I can combine. Like terms that I can combine would be a positive 2 and a minus 10. So here we go again. I'm taking a bigger number 10 away from a smaller number 2. I have to know that 2 minus 10 is going to be negative because 10 is bigger than 2. I'm taking more away than what I actually have. So I'm going to end up in the hole or negative. I can just flip that around. Make that 10 minus 2. Well, I know that 10 minus 2 is 8. So 2 minus 10 has to be a negative 8. So this can end up as negative 6s minus 8. And if I wanted to make this a negative 8 plus a negative 6s, that would be fine too. You know, whatever would work. Or negative 8 minus 6s, something like that. It could work when we do it that way. All right? But this is probably the most straightforward way. Negative 6s minus 8. All right, we got a few more to look at before we finish up. Negative 3 over 2 being multiplied by a minus 4 minus 2a. Well, this is negative 3 over 2 times a. There's a 1 there. So a negative times a positive is still going to be a negative, and negative 3 over 2 times 1 is still just going to be negative 3 over 2, because anytime I multiply something by 1, it equals the other number. The a just becomes part of it. Negative 3 over 2 times a negative 4. It's a negative times a negative, so I need to understand that's going to be a positive. So it's going to be 3 over 2 times 4 over 1. I can cross-check a 2 and a 4 by dividing by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 4 divided by 2 is 2. I cannot cross-check a 1 and a 3 because nothing can go into 1 other than 1 and 3. So I do 3 times 2, which is 6. 1 times 1, which is 1. I get 6 over 1, which is just 6. And since it's a negative times a negative, that's going to be a plus 6. I have the same thing over here, negative 3 over 2 times a negative 2a. So it's just going to be 3 over 2 times 2, which is going to be 2 over 1. Once again, I can cross-check a 2 and a 2 by dividing by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 2 divided by 2 is still 1. 3 times 1 is 3. 1 times 1 is 1. I end up with 3 over 1, which I know is just 3. It's a negative and a negative, so it's going to be a plus 3a. Now, if I want to think about negative 3 over 2, I may want to consider turning that into a mixed number, but I'm not going to just do that yet because I'm just going to simplify it and see what happens with the numbers that I have. So I'm looking at like terms and I'm seeing, well, negative 3 over 2 plus 3a. All right, so I'm kind of thinking, well, okay. So I'm thinking that if I have negative 3 over 2, if I want to think of that as negative 3 over 2 plus 3, because those are like terms, same variable, neither of them have an exponent, plus 3 over 1, because that's what 3 would be. 3 would be 3 over 1, 3 over 2 would be 3 over 2. I need to make a common denominator. I think I can make my 1 2 by multiplying everything by 2, and 3 times 2 is 6. So that gives me 1 times 2 is 2. 3 times 2 is 6. So that tells me I get 6 over 2. So that tells me that I end up with negative 3 over 2 plus 6 over 2. Negative 3 plus 6, I think, is 3. Okay? Because I can also think of that as 6 plus a negative 3. I can always flip an addition problem around. 6 plus a negative 3 becomes 6 minus 3. And 6 minus 3 is 3. My common denominator, 2, stays the same, so I get 3 over 2. So I see that when I add a negative 3 over 2 plus 3, I actually end up with positive 3 over 2. So these two, once I add those together, become 3 over 2a. What's left is my plus 6. That is my simplified expression. All right, well, here's another one. 3.5m minus 1.5 times m minus 10. It is important to understand and remember the order of operations. A common mistake that can be made here is we go ahead and subtract these, and we would get 3.5m minus 1.5, and we'd get 2. Can't do that. We got to clear parentheses first. Order of operations tell us parentheses, exponents, multiply and divide left to right, add and subtract left to right. So to start, I'm going to leave my 3.5m alone. Then I'm going to take this negative 1.5 and I'm going to multiply it by the positive 1m. Remember, there's a 1 there. Well, negative 1.5 times a positive 1 leaves me with a negative 1.5m. But then I'm left with negative 1.5, or negative 1 5/10, times negative 10. It's a negative times a negative, so I know that's going to be positive. And it becomes 1.5 times 10. Well, remember, when I multiply by base 10 numbers, all I'm doing is moving the decimal. And I'm moving the decimal to the right, how many ever zeros there are. So since there's 1 0 here, I'm moving this decimal one place to the right. And that tells me that 1 5/10 times 10 equals 15. And I'm feeling pretty good about that. So I'm going to put this plus 15 right here. Well, what can be simplified? Now is when I take care of the 3.5 minus the 1.5m, because now they're like terms. They both have an m. They both have an exponent. So I'm just going to come over here. 3.5 minus 1.5. Well, 5 minus 5 is 0. Drop the decimal down. 3 minus 1 is 2. I end up with 2.0. 2.0 is just 2. So this combines to be 2m. And then I add the 15. And that's my simplified expression. All right, this is the last one for this video. 4/5 times 10w minus 5 in parentheses. Negative minus 2 times w plus 9. Well, if I'm going to do 4/5 times 10, I'm going to think about that as 4 over 5 times 10 over 1. I can't cross-check a 4 and a 1. Nothing can go into those except 1. But I can cross-check a 5 and a 10 by dividing by 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1. 10 divided by 5 is 2. That leaves me with 4 times 2, which is 8. 1 times 1, which is 1. I know that 8 over 1 is 8. This is a positive. This is a positive. So I end up with 8w. Now I'm going to do 4/5 times a negative 5. So I'm going to come over here. 4/5 times 5 over 1. I'm going to remember that this is a negative and this is a positive. So this is actually going to have to be a minus sign after the 8w. Very obvious to me that I can cross-check a 5 and a 5 and make them both 1. And that leaves me with 4 times 1, which is 4. 1 times 1, which is 1. I get 4 over 1, which is 4. So minus 4. Here I get a negative 2. So it's a negative 2 times 1w. A negative 2 times a positive 1 is going to be a negative 2w. And a negative 2 times a positive 9, a negative and a positive, gives me a negative answer of negative 18. So now I just need to simplify, and I can see that I have 8w minus 2w, or a positive 8 and a negative 2. Well, 8w minus 2w is going to be 6w. Negative 4 and a negative 18. I can think of this as negative 4 plus negative 18. I can think of this as negative 4 minus 18. Either way, they become the same thing. Perhaps the simplest thing might be they're both negative, so just add the 4 and the 18 and make sure you put a negative sign in front of it. Well, 4 plus 18 is 22, so this is going to be 6w minus 22. And if you would happen to do the standalone numbers first and gotten negative 22 plus 6w, that would be just fine too. All right, that's simplifying the expressions. Talk to you later, 7th grade. Bye.